Good morning, everyone. Let's begin. Today by 5 o'clock, you've got two things, the homework and the project draft submission. I've already got many students have submitted their homework. I'll take it now if you have it. If not, just bring it up to my office, 3rd floor of the main building, way at the top. And I'll be at the wastewater treatment plant this afternoon, so if you need to turn it in when I'm not there, just slide it under the door. All right, for the project, remember that the main point of me requiring a draft is just so I can give you feedback. It's worth 5 points compared to 20 for the final submission, so it's a small fraction of the overall project grade. What I'm looking for is whether your assumptions are reasonable, well supported, because in this project you're going to have to estimate what your income is going to be, what your ordinary expenses will be, your extraordinary, meaning just sort of the infrequent big expenses that pop up through life. I want to take a look at what you're doing now so that you don't get too far down the road in the wrong direction. So I'll be looking at those over the vacation, and I'll try and type my feedback as soon as I've got it for you directly into iLearn. And I think you probably get a notification when I do that. Any questions related to the announcements? All right. Today we are starting on chapter 14 in the book. We are moving right along. This is class 34, and does anybody know how many classes we have in this semester? 43. Yeah, we're almost there. We're getting really close. All right. All right. So we've talked a little bit about inflation before, but we haven't gone into too much detail. Let me dim the lights so you can see this picture. Classic car. All right, this is a 1950 vehicle. It's a Hudson. I don't think they even make that brand anymore. And here's a price list for several cars back in that time. You can see that a 1950 Nash Tudor was only $13.95, and those are dollars, so less than 6,000 dirhams for a new car. And that's back in the ages before there was machines. You know, this is when cars were basically all handmade. And so there was a lot of labor that went into a vehicle back then. And the materials were harder to get to as well. If you think about what it took to produce a ton of steel back then, a lot more effort and a lot more labor intensive and energy intensive because of the developments we've had in technology. By the way, we're not going to actually need the computers today after all, so I'd suggest you switch off the monitor just to make it easier to focus on the lecture. We're not going to end up using Excel for today's class. So prices have obviously gone up a lot since then. I hear lots of clicking. There doesn't need to be any clicking right now. Right? All right. Here is a graph of the Consumer Price Index in the United States since 1900. And you can see back in the first half of the 20th century, the spikes were a lot more severe than they were in the second half of the 20th century. Any idea why the swings up and down in price were so much wilder in the first half of the century than in the second half? There was a major breakdown, right, and that was the Great Depression. It was in the 1929 to about 1939, so the 30s. This big spike down was during that period. And by the way, we're talking about inflation today, which means an increase in price. What is this called when there's a negative deflation? Right. We'll talk about deflation as well as inflation, but why do you suppose that now it's a little bit more smooth than it used to be? World Wars? Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah, there was, back in 1914 to 1918, there was a war, and so that probably explains this increase in price right here. And then World War II is that increase in price, and so it could be fewer spikes because there's fewer wars. Another big effect was what the currency is based on. And in the early half of the 20th century, currency was based on a gold standard. And nowadays, in the United States and almost every other country, there isn't a gold standard. It used to be that you could take your paper money to the Treasury and exchange it for a certain amount of gold. And now you can buy gold with your currency, but it's not set to a certain mass of gold. Sometimes an ounce of gold costs $1,100. Sometimes an ounce of gold costs $1,900. And that fluctuates, the ratio of dollars to gold. But the ratio used to be fixed. And back when it was fixed, the federal government didn't have as much tools in its inventory to try and manage the money supply. They had to have the same amount of money in circulation as they actually had gold in the vault. And so they weren't able to stimulate spending during a depression by increasing money supply. And it wasn't as easy for them to lower interest rates and sort of tighten money supply during periods of inflation. And so now you could say that central banks have more tools. The dollar? It's backed by the ability of the federal government to tax its economy. So like what backs the dollar? It's just trust. It's the authority of the government. When someone buys a U.S. Treasury bond, the reason they have confidence in the government is because in the United States, it's only the government that can tax the largest economy, well, second largest economy in the world now. Used to be the largest, now China is the largest. But it's not backed by any real resource. It's not backed by gold, silver. It's just the fact that it has the legal right to collect revenue from its citizens. All right, so here's some terminology. Inflation is just when prices are going up. And so you need more money to buy the same amount of goods or services. Can you think of some place that's experiencing inflation right now? Syria. That's the same example that in the earlier section some students were telling about their relatives in Syria. If they go to a restaurant, they have to take a stack of money just to buy a lunch. And so that gives you an idea that the value of the currency isn't what it used to be in the past, because probably 10 years ago you didn't have to take a stack of money like this to go for a meal, right? And so the price of some fixed amount of goods or services has gone up. So what causes the inflation in Syria? Why is it that nowadays it takes a bigger stack of money to buy something than in the past? All right, so you can think about money as a ratio. It's the value relative to the goods. And so it could be that it's harder to get goods into Syria. So there's a lower supply, there's less food, there's less cars, there's the things that people want to buy, it's harder to get it there. And so the amount of money required to buy those items is higher just because the supply of items is lower. That's a big part of what can cause inflation. Another aspect of inflation is just when the government is printing too much money. When people start to notice, it seems like everyone has a lot of extra money nowadays, because sometimes governments, when they're not collecting enough taxes, they think, just turn on the printing press. Print more money, maybe nobody will notice, and we can pay our salaries for the employees with money that doesn't really exist. But eventually, people catch on. People start to notice that everyone is on a spending spree, and so the sellers and the merchants will raise their prices as a result. So those are two effects that can cause inflation, is a reduction in the number of available goods and services, or an increase in the amount of money supply. We can express inflation in terms of a percentage rate, and the book assigns that variable the lowercase f. And it's usually an annual rate of inflation. And it's a bit confusing because sometimes in the newspaper, when they're talking about inflation, they'll say, during January, inflation was 3%. But what they really mean is that on an annualized basis during January, inflation was 3%. It's not that the prices actually went up 3% during January. It's that if they continued for a full year at the same rate that they did during that 1 month, then on an annual basis, it would be 3%. And it's something that journalists are always getting wrong when they talk about inflation. So you have to be very careful in reading those statistics. Yeah, it's the same thing. When they report inflation on a quarterly basis, what they usually mean is the annualized inflation. So if they say that inflation was 6% during that quarter, what it really was 6% divided by 4. So it would be 1.5 on an absolute basis, but then they're projecting that onto an annualized basis. All right, so if inflation is going up, what it means that if you have a certain savings account, all of your money is in the bank, and your savings account is only making the inflation rate, then you don't have any increased ability to purchase something. This phrase, purchasing power, talks about how much you can get for a certain amount of money. So for example, a dirham. What's the typical thing you can buy with 1 dirham? A bottle of water, right. So you can think of the purchasing power of a dirham as a bottle of water. In 20 years, the purchasing power of a dirham will probably be less than it is now. A bottle of water may cost you 5 dirhams 20 years in the future, maybe more. But if you want to have an increasing purchasing power, your savings account has to make more than the inflation rate. That's the implication of inflation. The real interest rate is when we subtract out the effects of inflation. And the real interest rate represents the rate of return that would increase your purchasing power, an actual gain in how much you can buy. And usually people want to have a real interest rate, the book says, of around 3.5% is what the average person is hoping for. And so that your inflation-adjusted interest rate should account for both things. It should account for both the inflation rate and the real interest rate. The book goes through the derivation of this equation, but it's more than just the addition of the two. It's the inflation rate plus the real interest rate plus those two things multiplied together, I times F. And that tells you if you want to make the real interest rate in an environment that experiences inflation of F, then you'd calculate I sub F to find out what your investments have to achieve in order to give you an increase in purchasing power equal to the real interest rate. So let's go back to this figure again. All right, deflation, when prices are going down. Now, for obvious reasons, inflation is dangerous, right? If you're getting your salary every week on a Monday, and they give you a certain amount of money in the environment where there's hyperinflation. And by hyperinflation, I'll give you an example of that. In the book, it talks about Brazil in 1994. Brazil had inflation of more than 200 million% during that year. 200 million%. That number is so big, it almost doesn't even make sense anymore, right? That would mean, I guess, if you have $1 at the beginning of the year, you'd need 200 million%. So I guess that would be 2 million at the end of the year to be equal to the same amount as the beginning of the year, 2 million. So if you're getting paid on a weekly basis in hyperinflation environment, that may mean by the end of the week your salary is useless. You know, you have to spend it as quickly as possible because by the end of the week, prices will be so high that your salary that you got at the beginning isn't worth anything anymore. So for obvious reasons, hyperinflation is dangerous. But what about deflation? When prices are going down, could that be a problem as well? What would be a potential issue if prices are going down? It seems like a good thing, right? What's that? Okay, yeah. People are going to want to hold on to their money. So think about what would be your incentives if you notice that a computer, you're thinking to buy a computer and normally it should be 3,000 dirhams. But then you go to the store and suddenly it's 2,800 dirhams instead of 3,000. And people keep talking about prices are going down. The incentive would be you shouldn't spend your money because you're just expecting the prices to be lower and lower. And so deflation can actually paralyze the economy because it creates sort of a perverse incentive where nobody wants to buy anything. And if nobody's buying anything, then you can't have a job because there's no money in circulation. And so deflation is actually a potentially dangerous thing as well. So most people agree that What you want is a little bit inflation, just so that there's a stability and trying to calm down the wild swings of the market. A little bit of inflation is better, certainly, than deflation. Yeah? Debts? Yeah, that's a good point. Debts, well, in a deflationary environment, you'd still owe the same amount of money, but you're earning less, and money is buying more than it used to. So, I mean, normally, if you have, like, let's say if you buy a house, inflation is a good thing. If you borrow 1,000,000 dirhams and there's lots of inflation, it means it's easier to pay back the debt because your salary is going up to match the inflation. And so if you're a borrower, inflation actually isn't a bad thing once you've already started your loan. But if it's deflation, it gets harder to pay back your debt just because not only are prices going down, but wages probably are as well. So you do not want to be a borrower in a deflationary environment. All right, so we're doing these calculations by hand today. We have the instance in part 1. A certain item costs $5,000 now. We expect 4% price inflation. So this 4%, that's F. That's the annualized rate that prices are going up. So with that, we can calculate the expected cost in 5 years. Now you probably remember this equation. The future value is the present value multiplied by 1 plus, and normally we'd put I inside the brackets there, where I is an interest rate. The same function applies for an inflation rate. It's just now that we're finding the cost in the future instead of the balance in an account in the future. So we can use these same table lookup formulas to find prices as we did to find account balances. So 1 plus F to the n power, where n is the number of years in question. For part B, you're going to use this formula at the bottom of the page. I sub F is what it's asking about in part B. All right, so let's take a look at the solution for the first one. For part 1, you can find the cost of the item after 5 years just by compounding the 4%. So you compound the 4% over 5 years, you find the factor, and it turns out that this item that costs $5,000 now is going to be $6,083 after 5 years. Okay? And the inflation-adjusted interest rate, if we want to earn 10% and inflation is 4%, the account itself has to make 14.4% in order for us to get 10% as the real return. So what that means is that your purchasing power is going to be greater even though there's inflation. Remember, if our interest rate and inflation rate are the same, then your purchasing power is static. And in fact, if your savings rate is less than the inflation rate, then your purchasing power is going down. And that happens to be the case for a lot of people right now, where inflation is maybe 2 or 3% depending on where you live, but most savings accounts aren't paying more than 1%. And so actually the value of your savings is going down because prices are increasing faster than the savings balance is. So that's a bad place to be. In this theoretical example, though, we're not in that place. We have a real interest rate that's larger so that we are earning more money than it increases the purchasing power. Uh-huh. Zero inflation, temporary periods. Like if we go back to this graph and take a look at how long it was crossing the axis, not long. Maybe for 1 month or something at the most that it's 0%. But more commonly it's in the positive range of these very brief spikes into deflation. Yeah. 2009, back when the financial crisis hit, you can see down here just for a little bit, people were pretty worried back then. A lot of companies were refusing to take letters of credit for selling new items. It kind of paralyzed the economy worldwide for several months until the government started lowering their interest rates to stimulate people for borrowing money and purchasing again and making investments. The interest rates have been very low for the last several years because of that, because of the financial crisis, and they've stayed low. Okay, now in part 2 of the in-class exercise, I asked you to consider the case of an Airbus 380. Those are expensive airplanes. Nowadays, the cost is $340 million, depending on what upgrades you put into it. There's a Saudi prince who actually has bought an Airbus 380, and then he put another $200 million into it to give it gold-plated door handles and concert hall, and I think has a steam room with like marble, and it has a garage. The Bentley can drive up into the airplane. Seems like a pretty nice airplane. I looked at a little diagram of it. But that one's more than this one. This is just your standard run-of-the-mill Airbus 380. So if we say that the price now is $340 million, and the price is expected to go up at 9% per year. I should mention that just because inflation for the economy as a whole may be 2 or 3%, there can be sectors of the economy that inflate or deflate at rates different from the overall average. And an example of that is fuel prices. What's been happening with fuel prices for the last several months? It's going down. They announced that December the fuel price is going to be less than it was in November, and November was less than October, and October was less than September. It went up a little bit when they deregulated. Up for the first few months, but it's been going down since then. So aircraft, maybe it will go up at 9% per year, even though other things in the economy are less. So if we want to find out what is n, this is the approach that I used. Rearrange the equation using the log function, solving for n, and 4.475 years. Now, what we are assuming here is that prices are increasing discretely, like in an even number of years. And so what we'd say is that after 5 years, the price will be more than $500 million. If it's going up in steps, like if the aircraft manufacturer is increasing their prices only once per year, then actually the price never would get to exactly 500. It would go from less than 500 in year 4 to more than 500 in year 5. Yeah. In normal inflation, it's more of a continuous process. It doesn't compound as discretely as this example, unless it happens to be someone who really does change their prices only once per year. And some companies do that. They will stick to an annual pricing cycle. But the economy as a whole is more continuous. Yeah? So you're talking about like in a quiz or homework or something. What I'd suggest is that you show the decimals and then write a short answer underneath it. Say, it takes exactly 4.475 years, but this is discrete compounding, so it should be 5 years that the price will be more than 500 million. And a short answer like that would show that you actually understand that it needs to be rounded up. So you've got some time off, right? Going on vacation. Anybody going to Europe or China? Abu Dhabi? You got some people going to Abu Dhabi. All right. Well, I hope you have a good vacation. Just remember that by 5 o'clock you should have your draft and the homework submitted. And I will see you Sunday.